There is a specific kind of quiet that descends upon a Newport, Rhode Island estate just before twilight. It is a very expensive, very insulated silence, broken only by the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic against the sea walls and the gentle clinking of baccarat crystal. Tonight, my property was bathed in the warm golden glow of 100-strung Edison bulbs. A string quartet played softly near the rose garden, and 60 of New England's most influential people stood on my manicured lawn, raising glasses of vintage champagne. At the center of it all stood Julian Vance, his arm draped protectively around the waist of my 32-year-old daughter, Chloe. Julian was in the middle of a toast. He was speaking about fate, about how the universe had conspired to bring a Seattle tech executive and a venture capitalist together in a crowded airport lounge. He had the crowd captivated. He was charming, self-deprecating, and handsome in that effortless, tailored way that suggests old money and good breeding. He looked like a man who had already won the lottery and was gracefully accepting the oversized check. I stood near the edge of the patio, my face arranged in the polite, neutral mask I had perfected over 3 decades as a forensic accountant on Wall Street. I was 62 years old, semi-retired, and a widow. I had spent my entire professional life hunting down phantom corporations, unraveling offshore tax havens, and finding the hidden truths that men tried to bury under mountains of paperwork. I knew how to read a room, and more importantly, I knew how to spot an anomaly. That was when Chloe slipped away from him. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, smiling at a state senator, touching the arm of her godmother, until she was standing right beside me. To anyone watching, it looked like a daughter checking in with her mother to ensure the caterers were keeping the hors d'oeuvres flowing. But Chloe didn't look at the caterers. She reached out, took my hand, and pressed a small, hard object into my palm. It was a silver flash drive. She leaned in, her lips barely brushing my ear, and whispered a sentence that made the summer air suddenly feel like freezing water. "Mom, I think this diamond ring was bought with some widow's pension money." Before I could react, before my brain could even process the sheer weight of those words, Chloe pulled back. She gave me a bright, flawless smile, smoothed the silk of her designer gown, and glided back to Julian's side. He kissed her temple as she arrived, and she rested her head on his shoulder, the picture of a blushing bride-to-be. I closed my fingers around the flash drive. The metal felt hot against my skin. My heart rate didn't spike, nor did I gasp. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford when you are staring at a discrepancy. I simply tightened my grip on my clutch, dropped the drive inside, and took a slow sip of my sparkling water. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you have to understand my daughter, and you have to understand the illusion of Julian Vance. Chloe had always been brilliant. She had inherited her father's creative mind and my relentless work ethic, building a formidable career as a marketing director in Seattle's brutal tech sector. But brilliance in business does not always translate to invulnerability in love. 3 years ago, she had her heart decimated by a man who had left her not just emotionally shattered, but questioning her own judgment. Since then, she had built a fortress around herself. Then, 14 months ago, came Julian. When Chloe first told me about him over the phone, I could hear a lightness in her voice that had been missing for years. She described a man who was 40, established, and remarkably grounded. He ran a boutique venture capital firm, she said. He didn't play games. He remembered the names of her colleagues. He asked thoughtful questions, and he never made her feel like her ambition was an inconvenience. When I finally flew out to Seattle to meet him 6 months into their relationship, I took them to dinner at an obscenely overpriced restaurant overlooking Puget Sound. Julian was a masterclass in behavioral adaptation. He anticipated needs before they were voiced. He engaged me on the nuances of international tax law just enough to show respect, but not enough to seem like he was trying to prove his intelligence. He was, by all social metrics, perfect. But perfection, in my line of work, is the biggest red flag of all. When an auditor looks at a company's balance sheet and sees no depreciations, no unexpected liabilities, and margins that hit projections to the exact decimal point, they don't congratulate the CFO. They subpoena the hard drives. Because life is messy, and a flawless ledger is almost always a cooked ledger. Julian Vance felt like a cooked balance sheet. Nothing he said was factually inconsistent, and his affection for Chloe seemed genuine, but there was a frictionless quality to his existence that bothered me. His background was a smooth narrative of prep schools and savvy investments, but it lacked the texture of real human struggle. Yet I said nothing. Mothers of adult, independent daughters walk a razor-thin tightrope. If you attack a man your daughter loves without hard evidence, you do not expose the man. You only alienate your daughter. I chose to watch, and I chose to wait. The engagement had come fast, a sunset proposal on a private yacht in Cabo. The ring was a flawless 3-carat emerald cut. When Chloe called me, weeping with joy, I congratulated her. I played the part. But the knot in my stomach had tightened into a fist. Now, standing on the lawn of my Newport estate, feeling the weight of the flash drive in my purse, I realized my instincts hadn't just been right. They had been critically understated. I endured the rest of the party for 2 more hours. It was an exercise in extreme psychological endurance. I made small talk with Julian's supposed half-sister, Valerie, a woman who had cried delicate, cinematic tears during his toast. She spoke affectionately about their childhood, but when I looked into her eyes, I didn't see a sister's warmth. I saw the cold, assessing gaze of a coworker evaluating a successful presentation. By midnight, the last of the black cars had rolled down the gravel driveway. The caterers were packing up the linens. Chloe and Julian had retired to the East Wing guest suite. The house finally fell silent. I walked into my study, locking the heavy mahogany doors behind me. The room smelled of old paper and the single malt scotch I poured myself. I sat down at my desk, a massive antique piece my late husband had bought in London, and opened my laptop. The blue light of the screen illuminated the dark wood as I plugged in the silver flash drive. A single folder appeared on the screen. It was titled J_IPAD_backup. Chloe hadn't just suspected something. She had actively breached his security. My chest swelled with a dark, fierce pride. That was my girl. I opened the folder. It contained dozens of high-resolution screenshots. I clicked on the first one. It was an email from an encrypted server discussing the liquidation of assets related to a Project Vi. But it wasn't the emails that made the breath catch in my throat. It was the next sequence of images. Julian hadn't just been doing a background check on the Sterling family wealth. He had mapped it. Displayed across my screen was a highly sophisticated, multi-tiered schematic of the Sterling Trust. This was the financial fortress my husband and I had spent our lives building to ensure Chloe would be protected forever. It held the Newport estate, a portfolio of commercial real estate in Manhattan, and an 8-figure diversified investment fund. It was designed to be impenetrable, but Julian's document had highlighted the structural seams. It was a blueprint for a corporate raid. There were annotations in red digital ink. He had noted the exact age at which Chloe gained sole signatory power. He had mapped out the jurisdictional differences between Rhode Island and Delaware trust laws. But most chilling of all was a flowchart detailing what would happen to the assets in the event of my death, and subsequently, in the event of Chloe's incapacitation or passing after the marriage. He hadn't just estimated her net worth. He had calculated the exact legal sequence required to drain the trust dry without triggering an SEC or IRS flag. The terminology used in the notes, spousal bypass, irrevocable transfer mechanisms, offshore asset staging, these were not the notes of a venture capitalist casually curious about his fiancée's background. These were the meticulous plans of a professional predator. I scrolled to the final screenshot. It was a ledger. A list of names, dates, and numbers. I recognized none of the names, but I recognized the pattern. They were payouts, settlements, divorces, bankruptcies, and next to one of the names, an elderly woman in Arizona, was a specific dollar amount that matched the exact appraised value of the 3-carat diamond currently sitting on my daughter's left hand. I sat back in my leather chair, the silence of the massive house pressing in on me. The ocean crashed against the cliffs outside my window, a steady, violent rhythm. If this man thought he was dealing with a naive socialite and her complacent mother, he had grossly miscalculated his risk exposure. He had spent 14 months auditing my family. Now it was my turn to audit him, and I was going to tear his life down to the studs. The morning after the engagement party, the Newport estate was suffocatingly bright. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the breakfast room, illuminating the remnants of the facade we were all still forced to maintain. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table, sipping black coffee, watching Julian Vance expertly slice a piece of melon. He was wearing a cashmere sweater that suggested casual weekend wealth, discussing the logistical merits of a spring wedding in the Hamptons versus an autumn ceremony in Napa Valley. Chloe sat next to him. If you didn't know her, truly know her, you would think she was simply hungover from the champagne and glowing with bridal exhaustion. But I had spent 32 years studying the micro-expressions of my daughter. I saw the imperceptible tightness in her jaw. I saw the way she carefully kept her left hand, heavy with the blood money diamond, resting under the table rather than resting it on his arm as she normally would. She was holding her breath. We both were. "Vivian," Julian said, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone that commanded the room. "Thank you again for last night. It was spectacular. You've made me feel entirely welcome in this family." He smiled. A warm, open, utterly convincing smile. "You're very welcome, Julian," I replied, my voice as smooth and placid as the surface of a frozen lake. "Family is everything to us. We protect our own." He nodded in agreement, entirely missing the promise embedded in my words. 2 hours later, the black SUV arrived to take them to T.F. Green Airport for their flight back to Seattle. I stood on the gravel driveway, waving until the taillights disappeared around the bend of the coastal road. Only when the iron gates clicked shut did I allow my posture to drop. I walked back into the house, bypassed my study, and went straight to the basement. Behind a false wall in the wine cellar was a small, climate-controlled vault where I kept physical copies of sensitive audits. Inside was a prepaid, untraceable burner phone I kept for emergencies. I powered it on, waited for the encrypted network to register, and dialed Chloe's private work line, a number Julian wouldn't recognize on her phone bill. She picked up on the first ring. She was already at the airport, waiting in the VIP lounge while Julian was ostensibly taking a business call. "He's at the bar," Chloe whispered. Her voice, usually so commanding in Silicon Valley boardrooms, sounded thin, vibrating with a mixture of terror and revulsion. "Mom, I sat next to him in the car for an hour. I could smell his cologne. It took everything in me not to open the door and roll out onto the interstate. What do we do? Do I call the police? Do I just leave my ring on the counter when we get to Seattle and vanish?" "Listen to me very carefully, Chloe," I said, my tone shifting from mother to general. "If you run, he runs. He will realize you saw the iPad. He will scrub his servers, liquidate whatever accounts he's currently draining, and disappear into the wind. And worse, he will still have the complete architectural blueprint of the Sterling Trust. He will be a ghost with a map to our entire financial existence. We do not let him run." "So what do I do?" she asked, her breathing ragged. "You do what you do best," I told her. "You are a marketing director for a Fortune 500 company. Your entire career is based on controlling the narrative, managing optics, and selling people a reality they want to believe. Right now, Julian's reality is that he has successfully cornered a naive heiress. You are going to sell him that reality so completely that he gets lazy." Silence hung on the line for a long moment. When Chloe spoke again, the tremor was gone. In its place was the cold, calculated edge she inherited from me. "You want me to be the inside man." "Exactly," I said. "You go back to Seattle. You plan the wedding. You kiss him. You look at him with absolute adoration. You give him zero reason to suspect that the trap has already been sprung. Can you do that?" "It makes me sick to my stomach," she said flatly. "But yes, I can do it. What are you going to do?" "I am going to pull his life apart," I replied. starting with his money. By noon, I had transformed my Newport study into a war room. Julian's public narrative was flawless. His LinkedIn profile boasted a decade of high-yield returns. He attended the right charity galas, was quoted in minor but respectable financial blogs, and claimed to be the founding partner of Vance Capital Partners, an elite venture capital firm specializing in biotech startups. But public narratives are just marketing. The truth always lives in the filings. I reached out to Marcus Thorne. Marcus and I went back 20 years. He was a former enforcement director for the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, who had left government work to start an ultra-discreet corporate intelligence firm in Manhattan. Marcus didn't deal in gossip. He dealt in raw, unfiltered data. "Vivian," Marcus answered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Please tell me you found another offshore tax evasion ring for me to play with." "Something much closer to home, Marcus," I said. "I need you to run a deep tissue diagnostic on a firm called Vance Capital Partners. The principal is Julian Vance. I want everything. SEC filings, K-1s, beneficial ownership structures, and any associated LLCs. Give me 48 hours, he said. I'll give you 24, I countered. And Marcus? Treat this with the same clearance as a hostile foreign takeover. While Marcus worked his channels, I began my own forensic dissection. I started with the basics. The state of Delaware's division of corporations. Delaware is the preferred state for corporate anonymity in the U.S. You can register an LLC there without ever putting your actual name on the public record. I searched for Vance Capital Partners. It existed, but as I pulled the registration documents and paid the premium fees for the expedited corporate history, the facade began to crack. The firm wasn't located in a gleaming glass tower in Seattle's financial district, as Julian had implied. The registered address was 1201 North Orange Street, Wilmington, Delaware. I leaned back in my chair, a bitter smile crossing my face. 1201 North Orange Street is a legendary address in the forensic accounting world. It's a single, nondescript brick building that serves as the legal address for over 300,000 shell companies. It's a mail drop, a phantom address used by people who need to move money without leaving a fingerprint. Next, I cross-referenced the firm with the SEC's Edgar database. If Julian was pooling millions of dollars from investors for venture capital, he was legally required to file a Form A-DV or a Form D to claim an exemption. 0 results. Vance Capital Partners had no registered securities. It had no clients. It had no employees. It was an empty box, painted gold to look like a treasure chest. Julian Vance wasn't a venture capitalist. He was a mirage. Over the next 3 days, the psychological toll of the double agent game began to weigh heavily on Chloe. We spoke only on the burner phone, usually at 6 a.m. Eastern Time, when Julian was in the shower. He's pressing for a date, Chloe reported on the third morning, the sound of running water echoing faintly in the background. He wants to lock down a venue before the end of the month. He's also casually bringing up the idea of combining some of our liquid assets to maximize our portfolio diversity before the wedding. Stall him, I instructed, tracing a complex web of LLCs on the whiteboard I had wheeled into my study. Tell him your wealth manager requires a 90-day cooling-off period for any major asset reallocation due to the trust's bylaws. Throw corporate bureaucracy at him. Con artists hate bureaucracy because it slows their timeline. He looked over my shoulder while I was typing an email yesterday, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I felt his breath on my neck. I had to force myself not to flinch. Mom, he's so good at playing the loving fiancé. It's terrifying. How can someone fake this level of intimacy? Because to him, it's not intimacy, Chloe. It's a transaction. He is at work. You are just his current client. On the 4th day, my secure email server pinged. It was a massive encrypted file from Marcus Thorne. I called him immediately. Vivian, Marcus said, and for the first time in 20 years, the grizzled SEC veteran sounded genuinely rattled. I don't know who this guy is marrying your daughter, but you need to get her out of that house. Now. What did you find? I asked, pulling up the file. The Delaware Shell Company was child's play, Marcus said. He uses it to funnel money from temporary LLCs that he burns down every 3 years. But that's not the headline. You asked me to look into his immediate family, the half-sister, Valerie Vance. My mind flashed back to the engagement party. Valerie, standing by the string quartet in a tasteful navy dress, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue as she talked about how she and Julian had survived their parents' messy divorce. Julian was my rock, she had told the crowd, her voice cracking perfectly. He's the only family I've ever truly had. I remember her, I said coldly. She's not his sister, Vivian, Marcus said. I stopped scrolling. Excuse me? I ran her photo from the engagement party through a proprietary facial recognition database tied to state DMV records and civil litigation filings, Marcus explained. Her real name is Valerie Pierce, born in Odessa, Texas. No shared parents with Julian, no shared birth state, no blood relation whatsoever. Then who is she? She's his partner, Marcus said heavily. And I don't mean business. They were registered as domestic partners in Nevada 6 years ago. But more importantly, she is his accomplice. They are a professional grifter ring. Marcus guided me to page 40 of the dossier. There were newspaper clippings, heavily redacted police reports, and sealed civil court summaries that Marcus had managed to pry open. Look at the Florida file, he instructed. I opened it. 4 years ago, in Boca Raton, a wealthy divorcee named Margaret Helms had been swept off her feet by a charming independent commodities trader. The trader had convinced Margaret to invest her alimony settlement into a lucrative offshore opportunity. To help manage the complex legal paperwork, the trader had brought in his trusted cousin, Valerie. Within 8 months, the trader and the cousin vanished. Margaret Helms' accounts were emptied of $2.4 million. The police could never definitively tie the trader to the theft because the funds had been willingly transferred by Margaret through a series of complex blind trusts that Valerie had drafted. And the Texas file? I asked, my blood running cold. Austin 2 years ago, Marcus replied. An oil heiress. This time Julian was an angel investor, and Valerie played the role of his heartbroken, dependent younger sister who needed medical treatments. The heiress felt sorry for them, added Julian to her primary accounts. And poof, $3.1 million gone. The heiress was so ashamed of being conned, she refused to press federal charges. They rely on the shame, Vivian. They rely on the victims being too humiliated to go to the FBI. I stared at the photographs of the victims on my screen. 2 intelligent, successful women whose only mistake was believing in love, left financially and psychologically devastated. Julian and Valerie were not just opportunistic scammers. They were an apex predator unit. They had refined their routine over years. Valerie played the emotional anchor, the fake family member that provided Julian with a tragic backstory and an air of vulnerability. She corroborated his lies, managed the legal loopholes, and likely handled the offshore money laundering while Julian played the leading man. The tearful speech at my home wasn't a sister's love. It was an Oscar-worthy performance by a seasoned criminal securing her next payday. Vivian? Marcus's voice broke through my thoughts. We have enough here to go to the authorities. We can build a wire fraud case. It'll take months, maybe a year to stick, but we can start. No, I said instantly. No, Vivian, this man is a serial predator sleeping in the same bed as your daughter. If we go to the authorities now with circumstantial evidence and sealed civil suits, he gets spooked, I explained, my mind moving at light speed, calculating the vectors of attack. He has an army of defense lawyers bought with stolen money. He'll drag it out in court, claim Chloe is just a bitter ex-fiancé, and Valerie will disappear with the funds they've already hidden. They will slither away and do this to someone else. I looked at the schematic of the Sterling Trust that Chloe had pulled from his iPad. He wanted my family's legacy. He wanted the empire my husband and I had bled to build. I don't just want to stop him, Marcus, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper. I want to ruin him. I want him caught in the act of federal fraud, on tape, with undeniable proof, so that he spends the rest of his natural life in a concrete box. I am going to build a financial guillotine, and I am going to make him put his own head in it. How? Marcus asked. I need you to dig deeper into Valerie Pierce, I said. Find out where she is right now. She's the weak link. Julian is blinded by his ego, but Valerie is the mechanic. If I can figure out how she moves the money, I can poison the well. I hung up the phone and stared out at the dark Atlantic Ocean. The game had fundamentally changed. This wasn't just about protecting Chloe's inheritance anymore. It was about neutralizing a threat. Julian Vance and Valerie Pierce thought they were playing a high-stakes game of chess against a naive girl and her oblivious mother. They didn't realize that I had already flipped the board. I picked up the burner phone to call Chloe. It was time to push Julian into making a mistake. It was time to raise the stakes. Here is Act 3, written entirely in English. I have focused heavily on building the psychological tension, emphasizing the horrifying realization of Twist 2, and crafting a breathless, high-stakes Climax 1. The tone remains anchored in Vivian's cold, calculated, yet deeply protective point of view. In the world of forensic accounting, there is a maneuver we call the stress test. You take a suspect entity, introduce a sudden, catastrophic variable, and watch how the principal reacts. Do they panic? Do they try to liquidate? Or do they run? Julian Vance and Valerie Pierce were running a highly sophisticated long-con financial extraction. They had invested 14 months of capital, time, fake documents, expensive dinners, and a 3-carat diamond into securing the Sterling Trust. But con artists at their core are pragmatic businessmen. If the return on investment suddenly drops to zero, they cut their losses and vanish. It was time to test Julian's pragmatism. I called Chloe on the burner phone. "We need to execute the audit play," I told her. "Tonight. You need to convince him that the well has run dry." "How?" she asked. Her voice was steady. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a cold, vibrating anger. She was my daughter, after all. "Tell him Arthur Penhaligon, our family lawyer, called you in a panic," I instructed. "Tell him the IRS has opened a comprehensive audit into the Sterling Trust's offshore holdings dating back to your father's tenure. Use the phrase, federal asset freeze. Tell him Arthur warned you that your inheritance might be tied up in litigation for a decade, and that you might even face personal liability. Cry, Chloe. Be terrified that you're going to lose everything." "If he thinks I'm broke, he'll leave," she said. "Exactly," I replied. "He'll manufacture an emergency. His firm will suddenly need him in London, or a relative will fall deathly ill. He will break the engagement, cut his losses, and disappear. And the second he tries to board a plane, Marcus Thorne and I will have the FBI waiting at the gate with the wire fraud evidence we're currently compiling. We end this without you having to marry him." That evening, I sat in my Newport study, staring at the burner phone, waiting for the call that Julian had packed his bags. The phone rang at 11:30 p.m. "Mom?" Chloe whispered. The background was dead silent. "Did he run?" I asked, already pulling up Marcus's contact info on my laptop. "No," Chloe said, and the absolute terror in her voice made the blood in my veins freeze. "Mom, he didn't run. He didn't even flinch." I leaned forward. "Tell me exactly what happened." I poured a glass of wine. I started crying. I told him everything you said. The IRS, the asset freeze, the potential that the trust could be entirely wiped out by federal penalties. I told him I was so sorry, that I might be coming into the marriage with nothing but debt. "And?" "He held me," Chloe said, her voice shaking. "He kissed my forehead. He told me it didn't matter. He said he had enough wealth for both of us, that he didn't care about the trust, and that he just wanted me. He was perfect. He was the perfect, supportive partner." A cold dread settled in my stomach. That was mathematically impossible. A grifter does not stay when the money disappears, unless... "And then what, Chloe?" I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "What did he pivot to? He must have pivoted." "He said we needed to protect what little we could from the government," she explained, speaking rapidly. "He said the IRS can seize bank accounts, but they have a harder time touching insurance payouts." He pulled out a stack of papers. He said it was standard premarital financial restructuring. He wanted me to sign over the primary beneficiary rights of a life insurance policy to him, just to shield it from the federal audit. My mind raced. Chloe, the Sterling Trust doesn't hold a life insurance policy in your name. We rely on liquid assets and real estate. I know, she said. That's what I told him, and he smiled and said, I know, darling. That's why I took one out for you last month, just to be safe. You signed the initial application along with the venue contracts, remember? I stopped breathing. During the chaotic flurry of wedding planning, signing catering contracts, floral deposits, venue agreements, he had slipped a life insurance application into the stack. A woman in love, exhausted by decision fatigue, signs where her fiancé points. Did you sign the transfer tonight? I demanded. No, I faked a migraine, she said. I locked myself in the guest bathroom. Mom, what is happening? Stay in the bathroom, I ordered. Do not hang up. I opened a secure browser and accessed a private subscription-only database used by forensic actuaries to track high-yield corporate and personal insurance policies. I bypassed the standard search parameters using Julian's social security number, which Marcus had uncovered, and Chloe's legal name. The search bar spun for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, the result populated. Policy provider, Apex Global Assurance. Insured, Chloe Elizabeth Sterling. Primary beneficiary, Julian Todd Vance. Policy type, term life, accelerated underwriting. I looked at the payout amount. The numbers blurred for a fraction of a second before snapping into horrifying focus. $10 million. And right beneath it, a rider clause that made my heart physically ache. Double indemnity in the event of accidental death. $20 million if Chloe died in a car crash, or fell down a flight of stairs, or drowned on their honeymoon. Chloe, I said, my voice eerily calm. The kind of calm that only comes when you are staring directly into the eyes of a monster. Mom, he didn't run when you told him the trust was gone because the trust was never his primary target, I said. It was just a bonus. He took out a $10 million policy on your life, Chloe, with a double payout for accidental death. A choked sob echoed through the phone. He doesn't want to marry you to steal your money, I told my daughter, gripping the edge of my mahogany desk so hard my knuckles turned white. He wants to marry you so he can murder you. The rules of engagement had irrevocably changed. We were no longer investigating a white-collar crime. We were preventing a homicide. If we went to the police now, Julian would claim the insurance policy was a standard marital precaution. Chloe had signed the application after all. The police couldn't arrest a man for buying life insurance. If we spooked him, he would simply vanish into the ether with Valerie, avoiding justice, only to resurface in another city under a new name, hunting a new woman. I refused to let him walk away. I wanted to trap him in a cage of his own making, and to do that, we needed the physical proof of his intent. We needed the master policy document, which contained the forged medical underwriting signatures Valerie had likely provided, proving it was a coordinated fraud. Where does he keep his sensitive files? I asked Chloe the next morning. His home office, she replied. But it's always locked. He has a biometric deadbolt on the door, fingerprint only. No lock is absolute, he said. Does he leave the door open when he goes to the bathroom? When he gets coffee? Never, she said. But yesterday, the Wi-Fi router reset. He had to go into the hallway utility closet to fix it. He left the office door cracked for about 30 seconds. That's our window, I told her. The next time he leaves the house, you go in. We need high-resolution photos of that policy, specifically the signature pages and the broker contact information. We need to tie Valerie's IP address to the policy creation. The opportunity arrived 2 days later. A torrential downpour had descended upon Seattle, the kind of heavy, relentless rain that turns the sky the color of bruised iron. Julian announced over breakfast that he had an emergency board meeting downtown and would be gone for at least 3 hours. He kissed Chloe deeply, told her he loved her, and walked out the door. Chloe waited until she saw the taillights of his Range Rover disappear down the wet street. Then she moved. She recounted the next 45 minutes to me later, detail by detail, and it is a sequence of events that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Chloe walked to the master bedroom and opened the utility panel in the closet. She didn't reset the router. She physically unplugged the fiber optic cable. The house plunged into a digital blackout. The smart home features, the security cameras, and the biometric lock on Julian's office door, which relied on a continuous network connection to verify the encryption hash, defaulted to its fail-safe mode. The fail-safe wasn't a fingerprint. It was a physical backup key. Chloe had spent the last 2 days turning his life upside down while he slept. She had found the backup key taped to the underside of a false bottom in his humidor. She retrieved the key, walked down the hallway, and slid it into the manual override slot beneath the biometric scanner. The deadbolt clicked with a heavy, satisfying thud. She pushed the door open. Julian's office was pristine. Dark leather, minimalist glass desk, no loose papers. It looked like the office of a man who had nothing to hide, which meant the hiding place was exceptional. Chloe bypassed the desk. Con artists don't leave their lifelines in a desk drawer. She went straight to the built-in bookshelves. She pulled books, checked behind frames, and finally knelt before a heavy, antique globe resting on a mahogany stand. She tilted the globe on its axis. The southern hemisphere unscrewed. Inside was a fireproof document bag. She pulled it out, unzipped it, and her hands began to shake. There it was, the Apex Global Assurance Master Policy, the Delaware LLC registration for Vance Capital, and a secondary passport with Julian's face, but the name Todd Masterson. She pulled out her phone and began photographing every single page. Her breathing was shallow. The house was dead silent except for the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the large windows. Click, flip, click, flip. She was on page 14 of the insurance policy, the medical underwriting section where someone had perfectly forged her signature stating she had no history of heart conditions, when a sound cut through the noise of the rain. It was the electronic chime of the garage door opening downstairs. Chloe froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Julian was supposed to be gone for 3 hours. He had been gone for 20 minutes. Maybe the meeting was canceled. Maybe he forgot a file. It didn't matter. He was home. She heard the heavy thud of the garage door shutting, then the sound of his dress shoes on the hardwood stairs. Thump, thump, thump. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her system. If he caught her in here, with his fake passport and the life insurance policy in her hands, she wouldn't make it out of the house alive. The $10 million would become instantly payable. An accidental fall down the stairs. A tragic struggle with a home invader. She had less than 30 seconds. Chloe shoved the documents back into the fireproof bag. She shoved the bag back into the globe, screwed it shut, and spun it so the seam was hidden. Thump, thump, thump. He was at the top of the stairs. He was walking toward the office. She lunged for the door, intending to lock it and pretend she was in the hallway, but she saw the doorknob begin to turn. He was already there. There was only one other exit. The office had French doors that opened onto a narrow wraparound balcony connecting to the master bedroom. Chloe didn't hesitate. She threw open the French doors and slipped outside into the freezing rain, pulling the glass doors shut behind her just a fraction of a second before Julian stepped into the office. Through the rain-streaked glass, she watched him. He looked annoyed. He walked over to the desk, completely unaware that his fiancée was standing 3 feet away, pressed against the brick exterior of the house in a torrential downpour. Chloe couldn't stay there. If he looked out the window, she was dead. She had to get to the master bedroom. She began to edge along the balcony. The wind howled off Puget Sound, whipping her hair across her face. The stone ledge was incredibly slick. She was wearing only socks. She had taken off her shoes so he wouldn't hear her walking, and the freezing water soaked through them instantly. She took a step. Her foot slipped on the wet stone. She pitched backward toward the railing, a silent scream dying in her throat. Below her was a 2-story drop onto a concrete patio. Her hand shot out, gripping the wrought iron railing with enough force to bruise the bone. She caught herself, her chest heaving, the icy rain plastering her clothes to her skin. She forced herself to breathe. Control the narrative, my voice echoed in her head. She pulled herself up and continued edging along the wall. 5 feet, 10 feet. Finally, she reached the master bedroom balcony doors. They were unlocked. She slipped inside, closing the door silently. She was entirely drenched. She left a puddle of water on the expensive Persian rug. She heard Julian's footsteps leaving the office, heading down the hallway toward the bedroom. She had 10 seconds. Chloe ripped off her soaking wet sweater and jeans, throwing them into the depths of her walk-in closet. She grabbed a towel, frantically drying her hair and face, then pulled on a pair of tight Lululemon yoga leggings and a sports bra. She kicked a yoga mat out onto the floor, dropped to her knees, and pushed herself into a perfect, deep child's pose, hiding her face toward the floor to conceal her heavy breathing. The bedroom door opened. Julian stepped in. "Chloe?" he said, surprise coloring his voice. "The power's out. Wi-Fi is down." Chloe slowly lifted her head, adopting an expression of mild annoyance. She pushed a stray, damp strand of hair behind her ear. "I know," she said, her voice remarkably steady. "It went out 20 minutes ago. I was in the middle of a Zoom call. I decided to just do some yoga since the house is a dead zone. Why are you back so soon?" Julian looked at her. He looked at the yoga mat. He looked at the slight sheen of what he assumed was sweat, but was actually freezing rain, on her collarbone. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The predator was assessing his environment. Then the flawless, charming mask slid back into place. He smiled. "The client had to reschedule," he said smoothly, walking over and kissing the top of her head. "I came back to surprise you. You look beautiful when you're working out." "Thanks, honey," Chloe said, offering a sweet, artificial smile. "Give me 10 minutes to shower and I'll make us some coffee." Julian nodded and walked into the bathroom. Chloe stayed on the mat, staring blankly at the wall, her entire body trembling violently now that he wasn't looking. She had the photos. She had the proof. But as she listened to the sound of Julian whistling a cheerful tune in the bathroom, the horrifying reality set in. She wasn't just planning a wedding with a con artist anymore. She was sharing a bed with a man who had already priced out her murder. I received the encrypted photos 10 minutes later. I looked at the forged signature, the fake passport, and the $10 million payout clause. The game of smoke and mirrors was over. It was time to go to war, and I was going to scorch the earth he stood on. Here is Act 4, written entirely in English. I have expanded heavily on the intricate details of the financial trap and the devastating emotional weight of the betrayal. This section focuses on Vivian's intellect and the horrifying realization that the conspiracy runs deeper than she ever imagined. There is a specific temperature to absolute rage. It is not hot. It is not a fiery, explosive thing that makes you scream or break glass. True, distilled rage, the kind born from a mother realizing a man has put a price tag on her child's life, is freezing cold. It slows your heart rate. It clears the fog from your mind, leaving behind a sterile, terrifying clarity. I stared at the encrypted photos of the Apex Global Assurance policy on my monitor, the forged signature, the $10 million payout, the double indemnity clause for accidental death. Julian Vance wasn't planning a divorce. He was planning a funeral. I picked up the burner phone and dialed Chloe. She answered on the first ring, her breathing still shallow from her near-death experience on the balcony. "Get out of that house," I said, my voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Right now." "Mom, I can't just leave without triggering his suspicion. He's downstairs making coffee." "You are the marketing director for a tech firm," I reminded her. "Manufacture a crisis. Your CEO is threatening to pull the Q3 launch. You need to be in San Francisco immediately for a 3-day emergency summit. Pack a carry-on, look stressed, kiss him goodbye, and get in a cab. Do not eat or drink anything he hands you. Do not stand near the top of the stairs. Do not let him drive you to the airport." "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. "Okay, 3 days in San Francisco. I will book the hotel under a corporate alias," I said. "Go." Once she was safely out of the house and in the back of an Uber, The real work began. I had 72 hours before she returned to Seattle. 72 hours to build a financial bear trap, disguise it as a pile of gold, and place it directly in Julian's path. I wheeled the whiteboard to the center of my study. I needed to execute a maneuver that would bypass local police, bypass civil litigation, and trigger an immediate federal response. I needed the FBI, and the FBI does not mobilize for broken engagements or suspected gold diggers. They mobilize for Title 18, United States Code, Section 1343, wire fraud. To trap a predator, you must offer him exactly what he wants, wrapped in the illusion of total victory. I sat at my mahogany desk and began to draft a prenuptial agreement. But this was not a standard prenup. I titled it the Sterling Trust Premarital Asset Integration Accord. I drafted the document to look like a complete capitulation on my part. The agreement stipulated that upon the legal solemnization of their marriage, Julian Vance would be granted immediate, irrevocable co-signatory rights to a $5 million liquid liquidity pool, entirely bypassing the trust's standard 10-year maturation clause. It was the keys to the kingdom. It was everything he and Valerie had spent 14 months working toward. But buried on page 22, hidden within a dense labyrinth of boilerplate arbitration clauses and jurisdictional jargon, was the poison pill. To activate the escrow account that held the $5 million, the contract required a good faith digital earnest deposit of exactly $1. This dollar had to be wired from a personal account matching the exact legal name on the digital signature of the contract, Julian Todd Vance, into a federally insured escrow account located in New York. Julian Vance did not exist. His real name was Todd Masterson. The moment he electronically signed that document as Julian Vance, and the moment he authorized that $1 wire transfer across state lines using a fraudulent identity to secure financial assets, he would cross the threshold into federal jurisdiction. The trap would snap shut. It would be an open and shut case of wire fraud and aggravated identity theft, carrying a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. He wouldn't even need to steal the $5 million. The attempted execution of the fraudulent wire was the crime. I spent 12 hours perfecting the language, but a document of this magnitude needed a final, irrefutable layer of legitimacy. It needed to be notarized, finalized, and logged by a licensed attorney. It needed to come from Arthur Penhaligon. Arthur had been the Sterling family lawyer for 2 decades. He was a fixture in our lives, a distinguished silver-haired patrician who had played golf with my late husband, drafted his will, and served as Chloe's godfather. I trusted Arthur with my life. More importantly, Julian knew I trusted Arthur. If the golden ticket came directly from Arthur's prestigious Boston law firm, Julian wouldn't suspect a thing. He would assume Arthur had finally worn me down. But my years as a forensic accountant had instilled in me a healthy dose of professional paranoia. Trust is fine, but tracking is better. Before I attached the PDF to my email to Arthur, I ran the file through a specialized cybersecurity program. I embedded a canary token into the metadata of the document. It is essentially a microscopic, invisible tracking pixel. To the naked eye, the PDF looks completely normal. But the moment the file is opened, the token silently pings a remote server, logging the exact time, the IP address, and the geographic location of the device viewing it. It also tracks if the document is forwarded or downloaded by a secondary party. I drafted a brief email to Arthur. Arthur, Chloe, and Julian have made their decision. I am tired of fighting it. Attached is the draft for the Asset Integration Accord. Please review the indemnification clauses on page 14. Finalize the formatting on your firm's letterhead and prepare it for electronic signature by Friday. Let's just get this over with. I hit send. Then I opened the tracking dashboard on my second monitor and waited. 2 hours later, at 2:15 p.m., the dashboard pinged. Document opened. IP address 192.168.x.x. Location, Boston, Massachusetts. Device, Arthur_Penhaligon_desktop. Perfect. Arthur was reviewing the file at his firm. I took a sip of my scotch, satisfied that the wheels were in motion. I expected Arthur to call me. I expected him to argue, to tell me I was being foolishly generous with the trust's liquidity. I waited for the phone to ring. It didn't. Instead, at 3:45 p.m., the dashboard pinged a second time. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my chest. The document hadn't just been opened again. It had been forwarded and opened by a secondary source. I stared at the screen, my eyes narrowing at the data populating the dashboard. Document opened. IP address, masked/VPN. Traceroute. Location, Las Vegas, NV. Device, Mac_OS_unknown, Las Vegas. Marcus Thorne's dossier had placed Valerie Pierce, Julian's sister and partner in crime, in a boutique hotel in Las Vegas just 3 days ago, allegedly scouting a location for her next mark. I picked up the burner phone and dialed Marcus. "Trace a live ping for me," I said the moment he answered, reading off the encrypted IP routing sequence. "Break the VPN. I need to know exactly what device is looking at my PDF." I listened to the frantic clacking of Marcus's keyboard for 3 agonizing minutes. "Got it," Marcus said, his voice tight. "It bounced through servers in Switzerland and Panama, but the endpoint is an Apple MacBook Pro registered to a V. Pierce, currently connected to the guest Wi-Fi at the Bellagio in Las Vegas." The air left my lungs. Arthur had forwarded my highly confidential, privileged family legal document directly to the woman orchestrating my daughter's murder. "Vivian?" Marcus asked, hearing the dead silence on the line. "Why does Valerie Pierce have your document?" "Because Arthur sent it to her," I whispered. "Your lawyer? The guy who read the eulogy at your husband's funeral?" "Yes." At 4:30 p.m., an email arrived in my primary inbox. It was from Arthur. "Vivian, I have reviewed the accord. It's generous, but if this is what it takes to bring peace to the family, I support you." I made a few minor boilerplate adjustments for compliance and shifted the jurisdiction clause to ensure a smoother transition. Ready for signatures. I downloaded his finalized version and immediately ran a redline comparison software against my original draft. The screen highlighted Arthur's changes in bright red. They weren't boilerplate adjustments. Arthur had systematically neutered the trap. He had changed the wording of the earnest deposit from a mandatory wire transfer to a waivable good faith pledge. He had shifted the legal jurisdiction of the contract from federal purview back to standard civil arbitration. If Julian signed Arthur's version, no federal crime would be committed. He would simply get the $5 million, free and clear. I sat back in the dark, heavy silence of my study. The mahogany walls suddenly felt like the inside of a coffin. Julian and Valerie hadn't just researched Chloe. They had audited our entire lives. They knew that the Sterling Trust was impenetrable without the cooperation of the gatekeeper. So they hadn't just seduced my daughter. They had bought my lawyer. Why? How do you buy a man like Arthur Penhaligon, who makes 7 figures a year? I didn't need Marcus to tell me. I already knew the signs. I logged into a restricted offshore banking registry I used during my days on Wall Street. I searched Arthur's name, cross-referencing it with shell companies in the Cayman Islands. It took 20 minutes to find the rot. Arthur wasn't just a lawyer. He was a silent partner in a disastrous commercial real estate venture in Dubai that had collapsed 3 years ago. He was drowning in over $8 million of undisclosed debt, leveraging client escrow accounts to cover his margin calls. He was desperate, and Julian Vance, smelling blood in the water, had offered him a lifeline. "Help me secure the Sterling Trust, and I'll give you a 20% cut to make your debts disappear." Arthur had sold Chloe's life for a fraction of her inheritance. A profound, suffocating sense of isolation washed over me. I looked at the photograph of my late husband on my desk. "I promised you I would protect her," I thought. "But the walls are breached. The guards have turned. I could not go to the police. The local authorities would see a respected attorney, a wealthy fiancé, and a paranoid mother spinning conspiracy theories. The FBI wouldn't move without the wire fraud trigger, which Arthur had just dismantled. I was completely alone. If I confronted Arthur, he would tip off Julian, and Julian would trigger the backup plan. the $10 million life insurance policy. Chloe would have a fatal accident in San Francisco before I could even reach her. I had to play the most dangerous game of my life. I had to outcon a ring of professional grifters, and I had to do it using their own corrupted lawyer as the delivery mechanism. I opened the document Arthur had sent me. I accepted all of his changes. To Arthur, and to Valerie in Las Vegas, it would look like I had surrendered. It would look like the golden goose was finally ready to be slaughtered. But then, I wrote a brand new clause. I didn't hide it in the arbitration section. I buried it inside the digital metadata of the signature block itself, a macro script designed to execute only when the final digital signature was applied via Arthur's proprietary legal software. It was a confession statement. By applying a digital signature to the document, the signatory unwittingly authorized a secondary, hidden transmission, a complete release of all medical privacy rights, an admission of utilizing fraudulent identification, Todd Masterson, and an automated forwarding of the Apex Global Assurance policy directly to the FBI's Cybercrimes Division, flagged as an active threat to life. It was highly unorthodox. It was arguably legally gray. But I wasn't trying to win a civil suit anymore. I was trying to drop a tactical nuke on a dinner party. I saved the document. I replied to Arthur's email. Arthur, the changes look perfect. Thank you for always looking out for us. Let's execute this on Friday evening at the rehearsal dinner. I want to hand Julian the finalized, signed portfolio as my official welcoming gift to the family. I closed my laptop. Outside, the sun was setting over Newport, casting long, blood-red shadows across the lawn. Julian Vance thought he was attending a rehearsal dinner. He didn't know he was walking into his own execution. And Arthur Penhaligon, the man who had kissed my cheek at my husband's funeral, was going to be the one who pulled the lever. I picked up the burner phone to call Chloe. We had a wedding rehearsal to prepare for. The rehearsal dinner was held at the Chandler at Cliff Walk, one of Newport's most exclusive venues. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the private dining room, the Atlantic Ocean churned under a starless, ink-black sky. Inside, however, the atmosphere was a masterclass in manufactured warmth. Firelight danced across sterling silver cutlery, and 50 guests murmured happily over plates of butter-poached lobster and dry-aged filet. At the head table, the illusion of a merging dynasty was in full effect. Julian Vance sat to my right, looking impossibly handsome in a charcoal Tom Ford suit. To his right sat Chloe, wearing a breathtaking ivory silk dress, playing the role of the radiant bride with an Oscar-worthy conviction. Across from them sat Valerie, sipping a vintage Bordeaux, her eyes glittering with the quiet, predatory satisfaction of a grifter who believes she has just crossed the finish line. And at the far end of the table sat Arthur Penhaligon. The Sterling family lawyer looked pale, his smile forced, constantly dabbing at his upper lip with a linen napkin. He had pushed the premarital asset integration accord through the final digital signature portals at exactly 3 p.m. that afternoon. Julian had gleefully signed it on his iPad in the hotel suite. Arthur believed he had just saved himself from an $8 million Dubai margin call. Julian and Valerie believed they had just legally secured $5 million of my family's liquid assets. They were all celebrating a victory that did not exist. At 9:15 p.m., as the waiters cleared the dinner plates and began pouring the champagne for the toasts, I caught Chloe's eye. She gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. Her posture was relaxed, but the muscles in her bare arms were coiled tight. I stood up and tapped my silver spoon against the rim of my crystal flute. The melodic clink, clink, clink cut through the chatter. The room fell entirely silent, turning their expectant faces toward the mother of the bride. Family, friends, and esteemed guests, I began, my voice carrying clearly to the back of the room. We are gathered here tonight on the eve of a monumental transition. Marriage is built on many things: love, compromise, shared vision. But above all, it is built on absolute, unvarnished truth. I looked down at Julian. He smiled back, a picture of humble devotion. When Chloe first brought Julian to us, I continued, I knew instantly that he was an extraordinary man. A man who paid meticulous attention to detail. A man who understood the value of a perfectly executed plan. Julian's smile widened slightly. Valerie raised her glass to me in silent acknowledgement. "But you see," I said, letting the warmth bleed out of my voice until it was as cold as the ocean outside the window. "My late husband and I also built our lives on meticulously executed plans. And we learned early on that the greatest threat to an empire doesn't come from the barbarians at the gates. It comes from the guards who open the doors." I didn't reach for my champagne. I reached into the sleek leather portfolio resting by my chair. I pulled out a thick, bound dossier and dropped it onto the pristine white tablecloth. It landed with a heavy, definitive thud. The smile on Julian's face froze. I turned my body, entirely ignoring my future son-in-law, and locked eyes with the man at the end of the table. "Arthur," I said. His name cracked like a whip in the silent room. Arthur Penhaligon stiffened, his champagne flute hovering inches from his mouth. "Did you really think," I asked, my voice dropping to a deadly conversational register, "that you could leverage the Sterling Trust to cover your $8 million margin call in Dubai? Did you think a Cayman Islands shell company could hide the fact that you sold my daughter's life to a professional predator for a 20% cut?" A collective gasp rippled through the room. Several guests shifted uncomfortably, thinking this was some avant-garde, tasteless joke. But Arthur's reaction told the truth. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him the shade of wet ash. His hand shook so violently that his champagne spilled over the rim, dripping onto his trousers. "Vivian," Arthur stammered, his voice reedy and thin. "Vivian, I have the offshore routing numbers, Arthur." I cut him off, tapping the dossier. "I have the IP logs of you forwarding privileged family legal documents to a hotel in Las Vegas. The Massachusetts Bar Association will strip your license before Monday morning. But that is the least of your concerns, because the federal government is going to take your freedom." "Vivian, what is the meaning of this?" Julian interrupted. He stood up, his voice coated in righteous indignation. He was trying to seize control of the narrative, playing the outraged protector. "Are you unwell? How dare you speak to Arthur this way?" I turned to him. The absolute, unadulterated venom in my eyes stopped him dead in his tracks. "Sit down, Todd," I said. The name hit him like a physical blow. The righteous indignation vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, blank stare of a cornered animal. Across the table, Valerie slowly lowered her wineglass, her eyes darting toward the exits. "Yes, Todd Masterson," I addressed the room, though my eyes never left his. "Not Julian Vance. There is no Vance Capital Partners. There is only a mail drop in Delaware and a string of ruined women in Florida and Texas." I picked up the Apex Global Assurance Master Policy from the portfolio and threw it onto the table, right over his dinner plate. "But you got greedy, Todd," I whispered, leaning in close enough to smell his expensive cologne. "You weren't satisfied with stealing our money. You forged my daughter's medical underwriting signature to take out a $10 million life insurance policy, with a double indemnity clause for accidental death. You were going to murder my only child." The room erupted into horrified murmurs. Chloe's godmother let out a choked cry. Julian's mask shattered completely. The charming venture capitalist disappeared, and the violent, desperate street grifter took over. He realized the doors were closing. He needed leverage, and he needed it immediately. He lunged to his right, his hands shooting out to grab Chloe by the throat, intending to drag her backward toward the service doors to use her as a human shield. "Chloe!" a guest screamed, but Chloe wasn't the terrified, passive girl he thought he had manipulated for 14 months. She had spent the last 3 days in San Francisco not at a tech summit, but in a private gym with my personal security detail, drilling this exact scenario until her knuckles bled. As Julian's hands darted toward her neck, Chloe didn't flinch. She pivoted on her heel, dropping her center of gravity. With brutal, calculated precision, she drove the heel of her palm upward, smashing it directly into the cartilage of Julian's nose. A sickening crunch echoed in the dining room. Julian bellowed in pain, his hands flying to his face as blood sprayed across the pristine tablecloth. Before he could recover, Chloe stepped inside his guard, hooked her leg behind his knee, and drove her elbow into his sternum. He went down hard. crashing through a tray of champagne flutes and hitting the hardwood floor with a massive thud. Chloe stood over him, her ivory silk dress spotless, her chest heaving, staring down at the man who had tried to price out her life. The heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room burst open. Marcus Thorne strode in, flanked by 4 federal agents from the FBI's white-collar and violent crimes divisions, their badges flashing in the firelight. "Nobody move!" the lead agent barked, though no one except Valerie was trying to. An agent intercepted her halfway to the kitchen doors, slamming her face first against the oak paneling and snapping handcuffs onto her wrists. 2 agents hauled a bleeding, disoriented Julian to his feet, forcefully securing his arms behind his back. "You have nothing," Julian spat, blood dripping from his chin onto his ruined Tom Ford suit. He glared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You have circumstantial evidence and an insurance policy she signed. Arthur finalized the asset accord. I signed it this afternoon. I am legally entitled to that $5 million, and I will tie you up in civil court until you die, you old bitch." I walked slowly around the table, the shattered glass crunching under my heels, until I was standing inches from him. "You really should have read the terms and conditions, Todd," I said softly. "I read every word Arthur sent," he sneered. "I know the law." "You know the law, but you don't know code," I replied, a chilling smile touching the corners of my mouth. "The document you enthusiastically electronically signed at 3 p.m. today wasn't the premarital asset integration accord. Arthur thought it was. You thought it was. But I embedded a self-executing macro script into the metadata of the signature block." Julian's eyes widened slightly, the bravado beginning to leak out of him. "When you applied your digital signature," I explained, speaking slowly so he could absorb every agonizing detail of his defeat, "the script executed a secondary synthesized document. It was a legally binding confession statement. You formally waived all rights to contest civil and federal claims from Margaret Helms and your victims in Texas. You also authorized the automated forwarding of your forged Apex Global policy to the FBI's Cybercrimes Division, flagged with a confession of wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. You didn't secure $5 million today, Todd. You signed your own federal indictment." Julian stared at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The realization that he had been outconned, outmaneuvered, and utterly destroyed by the woman he thought was an oblivious, wealthy widow finally broke him. "You played the paper game," I whispered to him. "But you sat at the wrong table." I nodded to the lead agent. "Get this trash out of my sight." They dragged him away. He didn't scream or fight. He just stared at the floor, a broken, defeated man. Valerie was hauled out behind him, cursing Arthur at the top of her lungs. And Arthur, my husband's oldest friend, sat weeping silently into his hands as an agent read him his Miranda rights. The room slowly emptied of federal agents, leaving behind a stunned, breathless silence among the remaining guests. I looked across the wreckage of the rehearsal dinner. Broken glass, spilled wine, ruined lives. Then I looked at my daughter. Chloe walked around the table and wrapped her arms around me. She was trembling, the adrenaline finally leaving her system, but she was standing tall. "It's over," she whispered into my shoulder. "Yes," I said, holding her tighter than I ever had in my life. "It's over." I looked out the window at the dark Atlantic. My husband had spent his life building a financial fortress to protect our family. But a fortress is only a pile of stones if there is no one willing to stand on the walls and fight. Tonight, I had defended the walls, and I had taught my daughter how to hold the sword. They say love is blind, but it shouldn't be. Real love, the kind of love a mother has for her child, sees everything. It pays attention. It reads the fine print, and when the monsters come knocking, dressed in tailored suits and armed with perfect smiles, real love doesn't just lock the door, it burns them to the ground. Dưới đây là phần cuối cùng của kịch bản, được viết bằng tiếng Anh với một tông giống đầy chiêm nghiệm, mạnh mẽ và vô cùng điện ảnh, tạo ra một cái kết hoàn hảo, outro, cho video YouTube 90 phút của bạn. Epilogue: The Legacy of Vigilance. 6 weeks after the rehearsal dinner, the Newport estate finally reclaimed its quiet. The autumn air had turned crisp, carrying the sharp, salty scent of the Atlantic. Chloe and I sat on the back patio, wrapped in cashmere throws, watching the sun dip below the horizon. A bottle of vintage Cabernet sat between us. Todd Masterson and Valerie Pierce were sitting in federal holding cells, facing a mountain of wire fraud and attempted murder charges they had no hope of beating. Arthur Penhaligon had been publicly disbarred, his assets seized, his reputation turned to ash. The Sterling Trust remained untouched. Chloe swirled the dark wine in her glass, her eyes fixed on the rolling waves. She was different now. The naive softness was gone, replaced by a quiet forged steel. I had never been prouder of her. "Mom," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "I've been thinking about the night of the engagement party, the very beginning of all this." "What about it?" I asked. "The iPad," she said, looking at me with a sudden piercing clarity. "Julian was paranoid. He used biometric locks, rotating passwords, encrypted servers. He never left his devices unlocked, not even for 10 seconds. So how did I just happen to walk into the bedroom when the screen was glowing, fully unlocked, displaying the exact blueprint of our trust fund?" I took a slow sip of my Cabernet, letting the complex notes settle on my tongue. A small, knowing smile touched the corners of my mouth. "You're right, Chloe. He was far too meticulous to make a mistake like that," I said. "It wasn't luck," she blinked. "Then what was it? Do you remember the Austin file? The heiress he and Valerie conned 2 years ago?" I asked. Chloe nodded. "She was too humiliated to go to the police, yes. But her younger sister is a senior cybersecurity engineer. She spent 2 years hunting Todd in the shadows, quietly building a back door into his personal network. She couldn't get her sister's money back, but she could watch his every move." Chloe's eyes widened as the realization hit her. "She saw the wedding announcement in the society pages," I explained. "She knew exactly what he was planning to do to you. So on the night of your engagement, she pinged his device. She remotely woke his iPad, bypassed the lock screen, and pulled up that specific spreadsheet the exact moment she tracked your phone's location entering the guest suite." A stunned silence washed over the patio. "She handed you the knife, Chloe," I whispered. "It was an invisible alliance, a network of women who refused to let another woman walk into the dark alone." Chloe looked down at her hands, no longer bearing the weight of a blood money diamond, but the strength of her own survival. She smiled, raising her glass to the unseen woman in Texas. "People like to say that love is blind. It is a romantic, dangerous lie. Love is not blind. People simply choose to blind themselves because the truth is too inconvenient, too painful, or too disruptive to the fairy tale they desperately want to believe." When my husband died, he asked me to protect our daughter. For a long time, I thought protection meant building an ivory tower. I thought it meant insulating her from the cruelty of the world, wrapping her in wealth and security so that nothing could ever hurt her. But this ordeal taught me the ultimate truth of parenting. You cannot protect your children by keeping them in the dark. You protect them by turning on the harsh, unforgiving lights. You teach them to read the fine print. You teach them to trust the cold knot in their stomach when a perfect smile doesn't reach a man's eyes. Real protection isn't a wall. It is a sharpened instinct. It is teaching your daughter that she does not need a prince to save her, especially when she has the intellect to audit the dragon and the courage to burn his kingdom to the ground.